So Prince William and Catherine just officially took executive control of the British monarchy, and King Charles has formally stepped back from public duties. But the absolute wildest part of this entire transfer isn't just that the king had to surrender his schedule. It's the single handwritten sentence Charles wrote at the bottom of the continuity order that completely shut Camilla out of palace decision-making for good. And honestly, the reason this whole thing blew up behind closed doors is because Camilla's team got caught trying to run a secret shadow court while the king was collapsing. Before we get into every single page of those leaked internal notes and explain how this power shift actually went down, make sure you hit subscribe real quick to Crown Watch so you never miss our weekly investigative breakdowns of what really happens behind palace doors. Alright, let's start where the crisis actually broke open, because how this story began behind closed doors makes the public version look like a complete fairy tale. And here's the part that actually gets crazy right from the start. For months, Buckingham Palace had been putting on this massive public performance, right? We all saw the carefully staged photographs of King Charles sitting upright at his mahogany desk, smiling through his meetings, holding red dispatch boxes, and issuing these super confident statements, insisting that his medical treatment wasn't slowing him down. The official message was clear. Everything is fine, the monarch is in charge, and there is absolutely nothing to worry about. But behind the scenes, inside the actual corridors of the palace, the situation had deteriorated so rapidly that senior officials were quietly preparing for a total collapse. Meetings were being cut from 45 minutes down to 10. State visitors were being redirected on short notice. Ceremonial rehearsals were being rearranged, so the king wouldn't have to stand on marble floors for more than 15 minutes at a stretch. And Prince William was already absorbing chunk after chunk of his father's schedule, without the public ever being told why. The moment everything finally gave way happened at precisely 11 in the morning on a dreary Tuesday during a closed-door rehearsal for an upcoming state ceremony in central London. Charles had shown up absolutely determined to power through the full walkthrough. He wanted to prove to his household and his advisors that he could carry the physical weight of the crown. But witnesses inside that room say that within 20 minutes, it became painfully obvious he couldn't keep going. The colour drained from his face until he went completely grey. His voice grew strained. His answers became brief and fragmented, and his focus visibly drifted as he leaned heavily against a ceremonial table just to stay upright. Like this is where it stops being a private health struggle and becomes an immediate constitutional emergency. A senior equerry stepped forward, the rehearsal was stopped mid-sentence, and the entire room was cleared of non-essential personnel. The king's personal medical team arrived within minutes, and the verdict they gave him behind closed doors was devastatingly blunt. If he did not step away from daily public administration, immediately, he was going to cause permanent, irreversible damage to his health. They told him in plain, unvarnished English that the daily grind of audiences, red boxes, and ceremonial appearances had to stop right now. That medical ultimatum triggered an emergency summons at Buckingham Palace that very afternoon. Prince William, Catherine, Princess Anne, and a tight circle of constitutional advisors were called into a private conference room on the first floor, without any formal agenda. When William and Catherine walked in, they genuinely believed they were there to discuss, covering a handful of postponed garden parties and maybe a foreign tour. But the second they sat down at the table, they saw a thick red leather portfolio sitting directly in front of the king's chair. Embossed in gold lettering across the front were the words, "The Royal Continuity and Succession Order." Charles opened the binder with trembling hands and laid out the reality. This was not a temporary sick leave. This was a complete structural reallocation of sovereign responsibilities. The king looked directly at his son and told him that, from that afternoon forward, William would take over state audiences, foreign ambassador credentials, senior palace appointments, and the overall strategic command of the institution. And then Charles turned to Catherine and delivered the second shock. She was being asked to immediately step into the public ceremonial role of the reigning sovereign's partner, taking charge of state banquets, diplomatic receptions, and the entire visible public programme of the palace. Catherine sat completely still, her hands resting quietly on the table, because she understood the sheer weight of what was being asked. Accepting that mandate meant stepping into the spotlight as the de facto queen in waiting before the public had even processed the king's decline. William pushed back, immediately warning his father that if this transition wasn't handled with extreme care, the public would assume he was staging a palace coup and pushing a sick monarch aside. But Charles shook his head and said the decision was non-negotiable. He told them he had to make the transfer while he still had the clarity to do it on his own terms. And honestly, you would think that a family facing a crisis of this scale would be completely united. But before the meeting could move forward, Princess Anne leaned over, reached into her leather briefcase and placed a second unlabeled folder directly on top of the king's desk. And that detail, that second folder, is the one that changes everything you thought you knew about this transition. Now here's what makes this even more significant than a normal change in the royal schedule. Most people watching from the outside see royal duties as just fancy dinners, waving from balconies and ribbon cuttings. But to understand why the palace was vibrating with tension that afternoon, you have to understand what the royal continuity and succession order actually does in plain English. We are not talking about a ceremonial title or a temporary stand-in role under British constitutional convention. When a reigning monarch experiences severe physical decline, there are basically two paths. You either go through Parliament to trigger a formal Regency Act, which is a massive, messy political spectacle that invites public debate, or the sovereign invokes the royal prerogative to delegate executive authority directly to the heir apparent through a binding internal charter. Charles chose the second path to protect the dignity of the crown. But the way this specific order was written completely rewired the power structure of the entire institution. Under the clauses of this document, William was not just filling in on the calendar, he was granted full sign-off on the royal red boxes, which contained daily confidential government intelligence, foreign policy, briefings, and ministerial appointments. He was handed the exclusive authority to approve senior household hires, manage the Crown Estate's strategic plans, and lead the weekly audiences with prime ministerial representatives. Basically, every single lever of actual institutional power was moved from Clarence House to Kensington Palace in a single afternoon. And then you look at what was assigned to Catherine, and that's where the stakes become genuinely unprecedented. The order explicitly transferred the leadership of the royal household's public and diplomatic diary directly to her. That meant state banquets at Buckingham Palace, white tie receptions for visiting heads of state, the patronage of primary military regiments, and the representation of the crown at major national milestones were placed under her direct authority. Think about what that actually means for a second. In the royal world, public visibility is the ultimate currency of power. For over 20 years, Queen Camilla had worked relentlessly to establish herself as the indispensable woman at the centre of the monarchy. Every seating chart, every guest list, every high-profile charity initiative had been routed through her private office. And with the stroke of a pen, that entire apparatus was being transferred directly to Catherine. Catherine was essentially being made the operational centre of the royal family's public identity. William understood instantly that this was a massive, dangerous responsibility. If the transition looked rushed, critics would accuse Kensington Palace of exploiting the king's illness to push Camilla out. If it looked hesitant, the public would lose faith in the stability of the throne. Catherine knew that every single dinner she hosted, every diplomat she greeted, and every speech she delivered would be scrutinised as a direct comparison to Camilla. And that's why William insisted on going through every single line of the legal briefing with the palace solicitors. He wanted to make sure that there were no grey areas, no shared jurisdictions, and no administrative loopholes that could create confusion between his team and his father's household. The solicitors confirmed that the transfer was legally airtight under the sovereign prerogative framework, meaning that once the king signed the document, William's executive decisions could not be overturned by any administrative board or private secretary. It was a total clean transfer of power, designed to keep the monarchy standing while Charles focused on his medical recovery. But as the advisors were finishing their explanation, Princess Anne tapped her fingers against that mysterious second folder on the table. And when Charles asked what was inside, Anne looked directly at her brother and said that before he signed away his authority, he needed to see what had been happening behind his back while he was sick in bed. And honestly, when you understand the private history that led up to this moment, you realise that this conflict didn't start in that conference room. It started decades ago, buried deep within the bitter power struggles that have defined the royal household since the late 1990s. To truly understand why Princess Anne was holding that secret file, you have to go back and look at how Camilla's household has operated inside the palace machine. For more than 20 years, Camilla had been living with the uncomfortable reality that her acceptance by the British public and the royal institution was fragile. She had started out as the most criticised figure in modern royal history, following the death of Princess Diana. She had endured years of public hostility, brutal tabloid headlines, and cold indifference from senior courtiers who viewed her presence as an ongoing public relations liability. Because of that history, Camilla's inner circle developed an almost military instinct for survival. Over 2 decades, her team at Clarence House quietly built an extensive network of loyalists throughout the palace infrastructure. They placed trusted advisors in key communications roles, cultivated deep relationships with sympathetic newspaper editors, and made sure that her private office had a say in virtually every major decision regarding royal estates, patronages, and ceremonial planning. Her position was constructed brick by brick, not just on affection from Charles, but on sheer administrative influence. What most people forget is that William had watched this entire expansion happen with a cold, controlled silence. As a young man, he had watched Camilla's circle gradually occupy the spaces that had once belonged to his mother. He had watched them shape narratives, manage press access, and position themselves as the modern guardians of the king's legacy. William never picked a public fight. He never gave an angry television interview. He played the dutiful son, attended the joint engagements, and smiled for the cameras. But those close to him have always known that he never forgot who was pulling the strings behind the curtain. Now fast forward to the king's health crisis. The moment Charles received his diagnosis, the fragile balance of power inside the family was thrown into total chaos. Inside Clarence House, the mood was one of quiet panic. Camilla's senior advisors knew that her influence existed entirely through her marriage to Charles. If Charles became incapacitated or stepped away from public life, the entire foundation of her household's power would vanish overnight. They knew that the moment William took over the old backroom networks would be dismantled without hesitation. And that brings us right back to the folder. Princess Anne dropped on the table. Anne had never been a member of Camilla's fan club. Throughout her entire life, the Princess Royal has been fiercely loyal to one thing, and one thing only: the institutional survival of the crown. She doesn't play media games, she doesn't care about personal feelings, and she has zero tolerance for courtiers playing politics with royal duty. Anne revealed to the room that 2 days earlier, a senior administrative clerk inside the palace had become deeply alarmed by a set of unauthorised documents circulating between Clarence House and private legal advisors. The clerk had quietly handed the files to Anne. What those papers contained was a detailed, highly confidential blueprint drafted by Camilla's private office, laying out a strategy to protect her authority in the event that the king's health failed. As William took the folder from Anne and turned the first page, his jaw tightened until his knuckles turned white. Because what Camilla's household had put on paper wasn't just a contingency plan for a supportive wife. It was an audacious, calculated scheme to create a shadow government inside the palace. And this is the detail that stopped everyone in that room cold. The plan outlined in those intercepted memos was staggering in its ambition, and honestly breathtaking in its nerve. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that while Charles was fighting for his strength in medical clinics, Camilla's private office had been busy engineering a way to keep their hands on the steering wheel of the entire British monarchy. The document was titled Administrative Continuity and Advisory Protocol for the Queen's Household. It was drafted across 14 meticulously typed pages, complete with structural organisational charts and legal annotations. The core of the proposal was the creation of a brand new, non-elected body called the Clarence House Advisory Council on Sovereign Affairs. Under this proposed setup, whenever the king was unable to attend state events or review red boxes, this council, stacked entirely with Camilla's private secretaries, senior household trustees, and long-time personal advisors, would be given formal statutory consultation rights. Let's translate what that means into plain-spoken English. They were proposing that Prince William would not be allowed to make major sovereign decisions on his own. According to the fine print of the scheme, William's expanded authority was to be formally designated in all official government circulars as temporary custodial and fully reversible. Any major changes to the royal calendar, any appointment of senior palace officials, and any restructuring of royal estate budgets would require what the memo called prior bilateral consultation with the Queen's office. If Kensington Palace and Clarence House couldn't agree on a policy or an appointment, the matter would be referred to a special joint committee, rather than letting William make the final call. And it went even further than that. The scheme contained an entire 5-page annex dedicated exclusively to the division of public ceremonial duties. The proposal insisted that Queen Camilla must retain permanent exclusive control over all major diplomatic events, state banquets, and national celebrations. Catherine was explicitly relegated to an assisting consort capacity, meaning that Catherine would only be invited to lead events if Camilla personally signed off on the delegation. Think about the sheer arrogance of that proposal for a second. The king's health was failing, the direct heir to the throne was stepping forward to stabilise the country, and Camilla's team was actively trying to relegate the future king and queen to mid-level employees who had to ask permission before hosting a dinner. Catherine leaned forward and studied the margin notes on the 3rd page. There were handwritten annotations, scribbled in blue ink, alongside the key paragraphs. One note beside the appointment clause read, essential to prevent Kensington Palace from establishing unilateral administrative dominance during the recovery phase. Another note beside the ceremonial schedule warned, Her Majesty's public standing must not be eclipsed by junior principals while the King is indisposed. The plan had come within 48 hours of being submitted to the Cabinet Office for formal review. Camilla's team had planned to present this framework to Charles as a helpful, practical compromise designed to lighten his burden while protecting the traditional dignity of his reign. They were banking on the King being too exhausted, too overwhelmed, and too emotionally dependent on his wife to push back against the fine print. William closed the folder with a sharp, heavy thud that echoed through the quiet conference room. He looked up at his father and asked a single chilling question. Did you know about this? Charles sat in absolute silence, staring at the names of his own household staff listed on the cover sheet. He had known nothing about it. His wife's office had built an entire political trap right under his nose. Okay, so here's the part that actually changes everything. This is the exact moment where the entire dynamic inside the royal family broke completely and permanently. William stood up from the conference table, walked over to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, and turned back to his father. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that freezing, razor-sharp edge that courtiers have learned to fear. He told Charles that there would be no shadow courts, no competing households, and no backroom committees managing his authority. He said that if Charles wanted him to lead the monarchy, he would lead it with complete undivided executive command, or he would walk out of the room and let Charles explain to the Prime Minister why the palace had no one at the helm. Charles knew his son wasn't bluffing. The King ordered his private secretary to immediately bring Queen Camilla into the room. When Camilla walked through the double doors, she was clearly not expecting to find William, Catherine, and Anne sitting alongside the King, with that specific folder open on the mahogany table. The room was totally silent. Charles didn't yell. He didn't make a dramatic scene. He simply pushed the 14-page Clarence House memo across the wood until it rested right in front of her. He asked her point blank if she was aware that her private office was drafting plans to restrict the Prince of Wales's authority. Camilla paused, adjusted her posture, and tried to defend the strategy. She spoke in that calm, measured tone she had perfected over 20 years of palace life. She said that her staff was merely being prudent, that the monarchy was facing an unprecedented crisis, and that an experienced household could not simply be sidelined, without causing widespread administrative confusion. She argued that she had dedicated 2 decades to supporting the crown, and that maintaining her office's involvement in state banquets and ceremonial planning was essential for public stability. Then Catherine spoke up, asking the one simple, devastating question that cut straight through the spin. When William issues an executive directive and your office objects, who makes the final decision? Camilla replied that any disagreement would naturally be referred to Charles for personal guidance, and that single answer destroyed her entire defence. Because the whole reason this emergency transfer existed in the first place was that Charles was too ill to carry the burden of government. Camilla's plan would have dragged a sick, recovering king into daily bureaucratic warfare between 2 competing households, forcing him to referee fights from his bed while his health fell apart. Anne looked at Charles and pointed to the word reversible, highlighted in yellow on page 6. That was the breaking point. Charles looked down at the paper, then looked at his wife, and something in his expression shifted permanently. For years, Charles had tried to balance his deep personal devotion to Camilla with his constitutional duty to his son. But looking at that document, he finally realised that his wife's household had crossed an unforgivable institutional boundary. The King reached into his inside jacket pocket, pulled out his classic gold-nibbed fountain pen, and pulled the official Royal Continuity and Succession Order directly in front of him. The document already had the standard formal signature block, prepared at the bottom, right above the heavy red royal seal. But Charles didn't sign his name on the line. Instead, he moved the tip of his pen down to the blank white space directly above the royal seal itself. And right there in his own distinct sloping handwriting, King Charles slowly wrote a single devastating sentence: no authority granted through this document may be challenged, amended, or shared by the Queen's household. The room went so quiet, you could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. Charles signed his name with a firm, unbroken flourish right beneath that handwritten line. Princess Anne immediately stepped forward, took the pen, and signed her name as the official royal witness. Charles looked up at Camilla and told her that the discussion was finished. The order was signed, the authority was transferred, and her household was legally barred from interfering with William and Catherine's leadership. Camilla stood in place for 3 seconds, looked at William, and then turned around and walked out of the room without saying a single word. And Camilla's team went into absolute frantic damage control the second she arrived back at Clarence House. But here is where their entire strategy fell completely to pieces. Within 30 minutes of the king signing that document, a certified sealed copy of the Royal Continuity Order was officially delivered to the private secretaries at Clarence House. Camilla's senior legal advisors gathered around the conference table to examine the text, desperately searching for any technical loophole, any vague wording, or any procedural flaw that would allow them to appeal the decision or soften the blow. But the moment they saw that handwritten sentence, written directly above the Great Seal of the realm, the lawyers closed their files and delivered the bad news. It was over. You see, in British constitutional law, a typed clause prepared by palace civil servants can be debated, reinterpreted, or renegotiated through administrative appeals. But a direct handwritten instruction, penned by the reigning monarch himself and witnessed by the Princess Royal, is absolute sovereign law within the royal household. There was no appeal. There was no negotiation. There was no backdoor. Charles had locked the door and thrown the key away before Camilla's team could even mount a defence. Her private secretary suggested a last-ditch public relations manoeuvre. He argued that Camilla should put on a brave face dress in formal attire and ride in the lead car beside Charles to the historic televised broadcast scheduled at Buckingham Palace that evening. The idea was simple if she stood right beside the king. Beneath the television lights, the public would assume that this transfer had her full blessing, which would allow her to retain her informal public prestige even if her legal power was gone. Camilla flatly refused. She understood that standing in front of world cameras while the king formally handed over the monarchy to William and Catherine wasn't a show of unity. It was a public execution of her influence. It would make her a decorative witness to her own demotion. She told her aides that she would not give Kensington Palace the satisfaction of having that photograph in the morning newspapers. 20 minutes before the royal convoy was scheduled to leave Clarence House for the broadcast, Camilla sent an urgent personal message to the king's private office. She asked if Charles would consider releasing a supplementary statement, affirming that she would continue to co-lead state banquets alongside Catherine. The reply from Buckingham Palace arrived in less than 15 minutes, and it was signed off by William's incoming chief of staff. The response was 2 sentences long. The Royal Continuity Order stands exactly as signed by His Majesty. No supplementary statements will be issued. The moment that message arrived, Camilla picked up her private phone called the Royal Muse and cancelled her official escort vehicle. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, the scene was absolute madness. Hundreds of reporters, camera crews and satellite trucks from every major news network across the globe were lined up along the Victoria Memorial. The British government had been notified that the king was about to make a major national address regarding the governance of the crown, and the entire world was waiting to see how the royal family would present this transition. Inside the palace, courtiers were scrambling through the corridors, adjusting the final protocol sheets. The royal schedule was updated with a single glaring correction. The Queen Consort's arrival time was crossed out in red ink, and her designated seat in the broadcast room was quietly removed. William and Catherine arrived through the private garden entrance, looking calm, composed, and impeccably prepared. William wore a tailored navy suit with a burgundy tie, and Catherine wore an elegant, understated forest green dress with no ostentatious jewellery. They walked into the private waiting room, where Charles was sitting, alone by the window, preparing his notes. The king looked up at his son, nodded slowly, and said that the cameras were ready. The moment had arrived, and the entire world was about to see who was standing at the centre of the British monarchy. And here's the thing you need to understand. Nobody announced the family drama to the public. Nobody released an angry press statement. But the visual message delivered during that live broadcast was so unmistakable and so powerful that it echoed across the entire globe within seconds. The broadcast began with King Charles, standing alone behind a dark oak lectern in the private audience chamber of Buckingham Palace. The camera framed him in a tight shot, and for anyone watching closely, the physical strain was impossible to hide. The king spoke for exactly 4 minutes. His voice was steady, but there was a deep, quiet gravity to every single word he uttered. I looked directly into the camera lens and told the nation that true service requires knowing the difference between stubborn endurance and genuine duty to the country. He explained that his medical recovery required him to step back from the daily, administrative and ceremonial burdens of the sovereign's office. And then without hesitation he announced that the Prince of Wales was assuming total responsibility for state audiences' diplomatic credentials and the strategic direction of the crown effective immediately. Next, Charles looked at the camera and formally named Catherine. He announced that the Princess of Wales would be taking over the leadership of the royal household's public and ceremonial programme, including the hosting of upcoming state banquets and diplomatic summits. The room was completely silent, and what stunned royal correspondents more than anything was what Charles didn't say. Throughout the entire 4-minute address, the king spoke about continuity. He spoke about family, and he thanked the public for their support during his treatment. But he did not mention Camilla's name once in connection with the future governance of the palace. The woman who had been the king's constant public partner was completely erased from the operational blueprint of the new regime. The second the king stepped away from the lectern, the heavy mahogany double doors of the throne room swung open, and the television cameras cut to a wide live shot that will be preserved in British history books forever. William and Catherine walked into the throne room, together side by side, moving with a calm, synchronized, deliberate pace across the crimson carpets. Positioned directly beneath the great golden canopy and the royal coat of arms were 2 primary ceremonial chairs. They weren't side chairs. They were the primary high-backed state seats traditionally used for royal receptions. William walked to the first chair and paused. Catherine stepped beside the second. For 3 suspended seconds, they stood before the world's press corps, completely still, letting the full reality of the image sink in. Then in unison, they took their seats beneath the royal insignia. To an outsider, that might look like a simple piece of royal choreography. But inside the monarchy, every single centimetre of seating arrangement carries constitutional meaning. That visual was the definitive announcement that the reign had functionally transitioned. William and Catherine were not just filling in for an afternoon. They were sitting at the controls of the institution, completely unchallenged. The photographs from that broadcast were flashed across every major news network in Britain, America, Australia, and Canada within 30 seconds. Commentators on live television were openly scrambling to analyse the speed of the shift. Some called it the most decisive internal transition since the abdication crisis of 1936. Others noted the profound symbolism of Catherine sitting in the primary consort chair, while Camilla was nowhere to be seen. Reporters outside the palace gates were already shouting questions at royal press officers. Where is the Queen consort? Why was Camilla not in the throne room? Is this a permanent transfer of power? The palace communications team stuck rigidly to their prepared 3-word line, a family matter. But the entire world knew that you don't cancel your car, miss a historic national address, and leave your ceremonial chair empty over a simple scheduling conflict. The line had been drawn in front of tens of millions of viewers, and there was no going back. And Camilla's team watched that entire broadcast from the private sitting room at Clarence House in absolute stunned silence. The collapse of their 20-year political strategy was complete visible to the whole world and completely irreversible. Within hours of the broadcast, concluding the palace's traditional communications machinery went into total meltdown. Royal correspondents who had spent years receiving private background briefings from Camilla's communications team suddenly found their phone calls going straight to voicemail. The friendly off-the-record lunches and quiet media alignments that had protected Camilla's public image for 2 decades were suddenly useless. Why? Because the formal legal announcements were now coming exclusively from Kensington Palace, signed off by William's personal press secretary. By midnight, the morning newspaper front pages were hitting the printing presses across London. The headlines were brutal. William and Catherine take command, the king. Steps back and across the front page of one major broadsheet. The throne room transition, Camilla absent, as new era begins. Camilla's remaining advisors tried one last, desperate spin attempt. They leaked a quiet background story to an evening tabloid, suggesting that the Queen consort had voluntarily stepped back from the broadcast to allow her husband to have his moment of connection with the nation. But the public wasn't buying it. Royal biographers and constitutional analysts immediately went on television and dismantled the excuse piece by piece. They pointed out that if this had been a planned amicable arrangement, Camilla would have been standing proudly beside her husband to project unity, not hiding behind closed doors 2 miles down the road. Inside Buckingham Palace, the administrative dismantling of Camilla's influence moved with ruthless speed and precision. By 8 o'clock the following morning, official internal directives were sent out across all royal households. The diplomatic guest lists for the upcoming autumn state visits were transferred to Catherine's private office for immediate review. Senior household administrators, who had previously reported to Clarence House, were formally notified that all future diary allocations, transport arrangements, and ceremonial budgets would now require direct written authorisation from the Prince of Wales's team. Long-planned meetings between Camilla's office and government departments were quietly removed from the master schedule. Charitable patronages that had been preparing major joint campaigns centred on the King and Queen were instructed to reformat their materials to focus on the Prince and Princess of Wales. One senior palace staffer described the atmosphere inside Clarence House that morning as a place where the phones simply stopped ringing. The access was gone. The influence had evaporated. The entire network of backroom power that Camilla had spent 20 years constructing had been unplugged in less than 24 hours. She had spent 2 decades outmaneuvering courtiers and critics who constantly underestimated her resilience. But William had never underestimated her for a single second. He had waited until the exact moment when the law, the king's signature, and the institutional survival of the monarchy were on his side. And then he made one clean, quiet, devastating move that settled the argument forever. And then late the following afternoon, William delivered the final irreversible closure to the entire crisis. And what happened in that final meeting makes the public drama look like only the tip of the iceberg. William walked into the king's private audience room on the first floor of Buckingham Palace. The television lights were gone, the cameras had been packed away, and the palace was completely quiet. King Charles was sitting in a high-backed armchair by the fire, looking visibly exhausted from the ordeal of the broadcast, but with a strange sense of relief in his expression. Catherine sat nearby, with a leather folder containing the updated diplomatic schedules. William placed the original signed continuity order on the table before his father. He looked at Charles and asked quietly, "Was the handwritten sentence truly necessary?" Charles looked up at his son, paused for a long moment, and admitted the raw truth. He said that without that handwritten line above the Great Seal, his illness would have become an open battleground. He confessed that if he hadn't explicitly barred Camilla's household in his own handwriting, every single appointment William made, every banquet Catherine hosted, and every decision Kensington Palace issued would have been fought over behind closed doors. Charles told William, "I spent 20 years trying to balance my marriage with the crown. I finally realised that when the crisis comes, the crown cannot have two masters." That was the confession that closed the book on the family feud. Charles hadn't written that restriction out of cruelty toward Camilla. He had written it because he knew that ambiguity is the absolute death of royal authority. And then Princess Anne stepped forward from the shadows of the room and placed that second sealed folder back on the table, the one no one had opened during the chaos of the broadcast. The cover of the folder carried a simple, chilling title in black type, Queen's Household Privileges and Residences After Transition. Inside that folder was a confidential pre-approved royal warrant that had been drawn up alongside senior Crown Estate trustees. It contained strict legally binding instructions regarding the future physical and administrative boundaries for Camilla's household during the king's retirement. The first section revoked Camilla's unrestricted master keycard, access to the working administrative wings of Buckingham Palace, restricting her clearance strictly to the private residential quarters. The second section outlined the transition timeline for Clarence House, establishing that within 18 months the administrative staff supporting the Queen Consort would be downsized by 60%. And then Anne turned to the very last page of the document. Right at the bottom was a scheduled timeline, specifying that in the event of the King's long-term withdrawal from London, Camilla's primary official base would permanently shift away from the centre of power to a private estate in Wiltshire, leaving Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle under the exclusive day-to-day command of William and Catherine. Charles looked at the page, looked at Anne, and nodded his silent approval. There were no arguments left to make. The paperwork was stamped with the official seal of the Privy Council, closed and locked inside the permanent state archives. No press release was issued. No television commentary was invited. The legal machinery had finished its work, and the royal hierarchy was locked in stone for the next century. When you step back and look at the entire chain of events, what you actually see is something far bigger than a family argument over titles, banquets, and office space. This wasn't just about King Charles stepping back to manage his health. This was the moment the British monarchy underwent its most profound generational reckoning in nearly a century. For over 30 years, the royal family had been defined by the unresolved emotional wreckage of the past, the tragedy of Diana, the guilt of Charles, the complicated rise of Camilla, and the constant awkward compromises made to keep a fragile family structure from cracking open in public. Charles spent his entire adult life trying to prove that he could have it all. He wanted to be a dedicated sovereign. He wanted to elevate the woman he loved. And he wanted to secure the future of his direct line. But history has a brutal way of demanding clarity. When his strength finally began to fail, the king was forced to confront the harsh reality that personal affection cannot be allowed to bend the constitutional rules of the crown. By putting his pen to that paper and writing that restriction above the royal seal, Charles finally chose the institution over private comfort. And think about what this means for Prince William, the boy who was forced to walk behind his mother's coffin at 15 years old, watched by millions of people while the world debated his family's survival, is now the undisputed operational ruler of the British Crown. He didn't achieve this through an angry rebellion or a public media war. He achieved it through absolute unyielding constitutional discipline. He waited patiently, mastered the machinery of the institution, And when the moment arrived, he stepped into the centre of power, with Catherine by his side, completely transforming how the monarchy operates. Camilla remains queen consort in title. She will continue to live with the dignity, the private comfort, and the respect due to the king's wife. But the era of Clarence House, operating as a shadow power centre inside the British monarchy, is officially dead. The door has been locked, the staff has been reorganised, and the keys have been handed to the next generation. The public will look back on that historic live broadcast from Buckingham Palace as the day the future arrived early. They will remember the image of William and Catherine sitting beneath the royal coat of arms, perfectly calm, perfectly united, and ready to carry the weight of the nation on their shoulders. Charles stepped back to protect his health. William stepped forward to protect the throne and the handwritten line above the royal seal, made sure the crown will never be split in two again.